The mud-caked wagon rattled to a stop outside Trinity's general store, and Celia Jennings clutched the threadbare shawl around her shoulders as 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the girl who had just arrived from the county poorhouse with nothing but shame trailing behind her like a shadow. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it during the entire 3-day journey from the poorhouse in Houston to this dusty Texas town where the summer heat of 1872 seemed to press down on everything with relentless weight. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete who had barely spoken 10 words to her the entire trip, gestured with his chin toward the mercantile. "Miss Abernathy's expecting you," he said, his tone neither kind nor cruel, just indifferent. "She runs the shop, said she'd give you work and a place to sleep." Celia nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She climbed down from the wagon, her worn boots hitting the packed earth of Trinity's main street. The town was small, perhaps 24 buildings clustered along a single thoroughfare, with the vast Texas prairie stretching endlessly in every direction. She could feel the weight of judgment in every glance, could practically hear the whispers starting already. "She came from the poorhouse," a woman in a blue calico dress murmured to her companion, not even trying to be subtle about it. "Poor thing probably does not have a penny to her name," another voice added. Celia kept her chin up, her hazel eyes fixed straight ahead as she walked toward the mercantile. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. Her parents had died when she was 14, victims of the yellow fever that had swept through Houston like a scythe through wheat. With no family and no means, she had ended up at the poorhouse, spending 4 long years scrubbing floors and mending clothes and trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity she could find. Now, at 18, she had finally been offered this opportunity. Work for Miss Abernathy in exchange for room and board. It was not much, but it was a chance to start over, to build something resembling a life. The mercantile door swung open before she could reach it, and a stern-faced woman in her 50s stepped out. Miss Abernathy had iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Celia's appearance in a single sweeping glance. "You are late," Miss Abernathy said flatly. "I expected you yesterday." "The wagon had trouble with a wheel, madam," Celia replied quietly. "We had to stop for repairs." Miss Abernathy's expression did not soften. "Well, you are here now. Come inside. I will show you where you will sleep and what your duties will be. I expect hard work, girl. I do not tolerate laziness or complaints." "Yes, madam." Celia followed Miss Abernathy into the dim interior of the store, breathing in the familiar scents of flour and tobacco and leather. The space was cramped, every inch packed with goods, barrels of beans and rice, shelves lined with canned goods, bolts of fabric stacked against one wall. A narrow staircase at the back led to the upper floor. "You will sleep in the storage room upstairs," Miss Abernathy said, already climbing the steps. "It is not much, but it is clean. You will be up at dawn to sweep the store and restock the shelves. During the day, you will help customers and keep the accounts. I will provide 2 meals a day and $1 a week in wages. On Sundays, you may attend church if you wish, but you will still need to prepare supper." The storage room turned out to be barely larger than a closet, with a narrow cot, a single window, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. Celia set down her small bundle of possessions, 2 dresses, a spare pair of stockings, a hairbrush, and a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, and turned to face Miss Abernathy. "Thank you for this opportunity, madam," she said sincerely. "I will work hard. You will not regret taking me on." Miss Abernathy's expression remained skeptical. "We shall see. Now come down and I will show you the inventory system." The rest of that first day passed in a blur of information and tasks. Celia learned where every item in the store was kept, memorized the prices, and began to understand Miss Abernathy's exacting standards. By the time evening fell and the store closed, her feet ached and her head spun with exhaustion, but she had made it through her first day. She lay on the narrow cot that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Trinity settling into sleep. The distant bark of a dog, the creak of the building's timbers, the low murmur of voices from the saloon down the street. Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come easily. She could not stop thinking about the whispers, the stares, the way the townspeople had looked at her as though she were something to be pitied or avoided. But she had faced worse. She would prove herself here, would show them all that her past did not define her future. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm. Celia rose before dawn, swept and cleaned the store, helped customers throughout the day, and collapsed into bed each night too tired to do anything but sleep. Miss Abernathy was a demanding employer, quick to criticize any mistake and sparing with praise, but Celia learned quickly. She discovered that she had a good head for numbers and a way with customers that sometimes even coaxed a grudging nod of approval from her employer. Still, the whispers followed her everywhere. When she walked to the well to fetch water, women would fall silent as she approached. When she attended church on Sunday, families shifted in their pews to keep a careful distance. She was the girl from the poorhouse, marked by poverty and misfortune, and Trinity's good citizens seemed determined not to let her forget it. 3 weeks after her arrival, everything changed. It was mid-morning, and Celia was arranging a display of ribbons near the front window when the door opened and a mountain of a man ducked through the entrance. He had to be at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly spanned the doorway. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, somewhat shaggy but clean, and his face was weathered and tanned from years spent outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking gray blue, sharp and intelligent despite his rough appearance. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple homespun shirt that strained across a chest thick with muscle. His arms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, were corded with strength, the kind that came from hard physical labor. A knife hung from his belt, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. Quinn Osborne had lived in the Trinity area for 5 years, though few townspeople could claim to know him well. He had built a cabin in the hills 15 miles north of town, where he trapped and hunted and occasionally brought in furs to trade. He came to Trinity perhaps once a month for supplies, conducted his business efficiently, and left without much conversation. Miss Abernathy looked up from her ledger. "Mr. Osborne, your usual order?" "Yes, madam." His voice was deep and quiet, with the careful enunciation of a man who did not waste words. "And I will need some extra salt this time, 20 pounds if you have it." "Celia, fetch Mr. Osborne's order," Miss Abernathy commanded. "The list is on the counter." Celia moved quickly, gathering the items: flour, coffee, beans, sugar, ammunition for his rifle, a new whetstone. She was acutely aware of the mountain man's presence, could feel his gaze following her movements, though when she glanced up he was politely looking elsewhere. She carried the supplies to the counter and began tallying the cost. Her fingers moved swiftly over the ledger, adding the numbers. "That will be $8.45, sir," she said quietly. Quinn pulled a leather pouch from his pocket and counted out the coins. As he placed them on the counter, his hand accidentally brushed hers. The contact was brief, innocent, but Celia felt a jolt of something she could not quite name run through her. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. Up close, his face was striking. Not handsome in a conventional sense, but strong and honest, with a straight nose, firm jaw, and those remarkable eyes that seemed to see more than most people did. "You are welcome, sir," she managed. He gathered his supplies, loading them into a canvas pack, but before he turned to leave, he paused. "You are new in town." It was a statement, not a question, but Celia nodded anyway. "Yes, sir. I've been here about 3 weeks. Quinn Osborne." He did not extend his hand, perhaps aware that such a gesture might be too forward, but there was something almost courteous in the way he introduced himself. "Celia Jennings." Miss Abernathy was watching the exchange with narrowed eyes, and Celia quickly busied herself with straightening the counter. Quinn nodded once more and left, the door closing softly behind his substantial frame. "Do not get ideas about that one," Miss Abernathy said sharply once he was gone. "Quinn Osborne is not the sort of man who involves himself with town girls. He keeps to himself up in those hills." "I was not getting ideas, madam," Celia replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "I was simply being polite to a customer." See that you remember your place, girl." But even as Celia went back to her work, she could not quite forget those gray-blue eyes or the way Quinn had looked at her not with pity or judgment, but with something that might have been simple human kindness. The next Sunday, Celia attended the service at Trinity's small white church. She sat alone in the back pew, as had become her habit, and tried to focus on Reverend Thomas's sermon about charity and compassion. The irony was not lost on her, given how little charity or compassion Trinity's citizens had shown her. When the service ended, she stood to leave, only to find Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife, and Trinity's self-appointed social arbiter, blocking her path. "Celia Jennings," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice carrying across the church, "I understand you came to us from the Houston Poorhouse." The remaining congregation members turned to watch. Celia felt her spine stiffen, felt the old shame trying to rise up and choke her, but she pushed it down. "Yes, madam. My parents died when I was young. I had nowhere else to go." "How unfortunate." Mrs. Hartwell's tone suggested she found it unfortunate primarily because it meant Trinity now had to deal with a poorhouse girl. "You must understand that we have standards in this town. We are a respectable community. I do hope you will not bring any of the poorhouse's less savory elements here." Celia's hands clenched at her sides. "I am simply trying to work and live an honest life, madam, nothing more." "See that you do. We would hate to have any trouble." Before Celia could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Hartwell." Everyone turned. Quinn Osborne stood in the church doorway, still dressed in his rough frontier clothes, but with his hat in his hands. He rarely attended services, making his appearance all the more striking. "Mr. Osborne," Mrs. Hartwell said, clearly flustered, "I did not realize you were here. I just arrived." He stepped fully into the church, his presence seeming to fill the small space. "I could not help but overhear your conversation. Seems to me that working hard and living honest is exactly what any town should want from its people. Miss Jennings here seems to be doing just that." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed. "Well, I simply meant—" "I know what you meant, madam." Quinn's voice remained polite but firm. "But judging a person by their circumstances rather than their character does not seem very Christian, does it? Especially not right after a sermon on charity." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Hartwell opened and closed her mouth several times, looking for all the world like a fish gasping on dry land. Finally, she gathered her skirts and swept past Quinn without another word, her husband hurrying after her. The other church members dispersed quickly, suddenly very interested in getting home for their Sunday dinners. Within moments, only Celia and Quinn remained. "You did not have to do that," Celia said quietly, though her heart was pounding with a mixture of gratitude and something else she could not quite identify. "Yes, I did." Quinn settled his hat back on his head. "That woman has no right to treat you that way. She is just saying what everyone else thinks. Then everyone else is wrong." He said it with such simple conviction that Celia felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of shame and anger she had been carrying for 4 long years. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back sudden tears. Quinn looked uncomfortable with her emotion, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Would you like me to walk you back to the store? I need to speak with Miss Abernathy about an order anyway." It was a transparent excuse, but Celia accepted it gratefully. They walked together down Trinity's dusty main street, and Celia was acutely aware of the eyes watching from windows, the fresh wave of whispers that would surely follow. But with Quinn's solid presence beside her, she found she did not care quite as much. "How long have you lived in the hills, Mr. Osborne?" she asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had defended her to Trinity's social elite. 5 years, give or take. I came out here after the war." "The war?" She glanced up at him. He would have been young then, probably barely 20. "I was in the Union Army, fought in Virginia and Tennessee." His voice was carefully neutral, and Celia understood. Texas had been Confederate territory, and old wounds from the war still ran deep. "After it ended, I did not much feel like going back to Ohio. Too many memories, too many ghosts. So I headed west and ended up here." "Do you like it? Living alone in the wilderness?" He considered the question seriously. "Most days. It is quiet, peaceful. A man can think up there, can work with his hands and see the results of his labor. But I will not lie and say it is not lonely sometimes." They had reached the mercantile. Quinn opened the door for her, and Celia slipped inside, relieved to be out of the public eye. Miss Abernathy was upstairs, giving them a moment of privacy. "Thank you again, Mr. Osborne," Celia said, "for what you did at the church. It meant a great deal to me." "Quinn," he said, You can call me Quinn." She smiled, a real smile this time. "Then you should call me Celia." His stern face softened slightly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Celia, that is a pretty name." Before she could respond, Miss Abernathy's footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Quinn quickly assumed a businesslike demeanor. He placed his order, paid, and left, but not before catching Celia's eye one last time with an expression that made her heart flutter strangely in her chest. Over the following weeks, Quinn began coming to town more frequently. Where before he had made the trip perhaps once a month, now he appeared every week, sometimes twice. He always had some legitimate reason. He needed supplies, wanted to check on an order, had pelts to trade. But Celia noticed that his visits seemed to coincide with times when she was working in the store, and that he always found some reason to speak with her, even if just to exchange a few polite words. Miss Abernathy noticed too, and she was not pleased. "That mountain man is sniffing around you like a dog after a bone," she said disapprovingly one evening after Quinn had left. "I told you not to get ideas." "I'm not getting ideas," Celia protested. "He is just friendly." "Men are never just friendly, girl, especially not men like that. He lives alone up in those hills. Lord knows what kind of life he leads up there. You would do well to remember your station and not go putting on airs just because a man pays you some attention." Celia bit back the sharp retort that rose to her lips. Miss Abernathy had given her this position when no one else would, and she could not afford to lose it. But the older woman's words stung, not least because they echoed the whispers that still followed Celia through town. "She thinks she is too good for the poorhouse now," she had overheard one woman say at the well. "That mountain man is just toying with her," another had added. "Men like that do not marry girls like her." Girls like her. As though coming from poverty was some sort of moral failing, some stain that could never be washed away. But when Quinn looked at her, Celia did not see judgment or pity. She saw respect, saw kindness, saw something that made her dare to hope that maybe, just maybe, her past did not have to define her future. One sweltering afternoon in late July, Quinn came into the store, looking troubled. Celia was alone, Miss Abernathy having gone to visit her sister in the next town and leaving Celia in charge for the day. "Is something wrong?" Celia asked, noting the tension in Quinn's shoulders. "Storm is coming," he said. "A bad one, from the look of the sky. I wanted to make sure the town was prepared, but I have been trying to tell folks and they do not seem inclined to listen to me." Celia stepped to the window and looked out. The sky to the west was indeed darkening, heavy clouds rolling in like a bruise spreading across the horizon. The air had that strange, thick quality that often preceded violent weather. "What should we do?" she asked. "Secure anything that can blow away. Make sure people get their livestock under cover. Board up windows if possible." He ran a hand through his shaggy hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I just tried to warn the Hartwells, but Mrs. Hartwell shut the door in my face." "Let me try," Celia said impulsively. "I will go door to door. People might not listen to you, but surely they will listen to a warning about the weather." Quinn looked doubtful. "Celia, those people have not exactly been welcoming to you either." "No, but I'm still part of this town, whether they like it or not, and if there is danger coming, we have to try to warn everyone." Something that might have been admiration flickered across Quinn's face. "All right, I will start on the north end of town. You take the south. We will meet back here." They split up and Celia hurried from building to building, knocking on doors and delivering Quinn's warning. Some people thanked her grudgingly, others dismissed her concerns, but most at least listened. By the time she made it back to the mercantile, the wind had picked up and the first fat drops of rain were beginning to fall. Quinn arrived moments later, breathing hard from running. "That is the best we can do," he said. "Now we need to get you somewhere safe." "The mercantile has a cellar," Celia said. "Miss Abernathy showed me when I first arrived." "Good. Let's get down there." They had just reached the cellar door when the storm hit with terrifying force. The wind shrieked like a living thing, and rain pounded against the building with enough force to rattle the walls. Quinn pulled Celia down the steep stairs into the cellar, closing the heavy door behind them. The cellar was small and damp, lit by a single lantern that Celia fumbled to light with shaking hands. Overhead, the storm raged, the sound of wind and rain and what might have been objects hitting the building, creating a cacophony that made conversation nearly impossible. Quinn guided Celia to sit on a barrel in the corner, then positioned himself between her and the stairs, as though he could physically shield her from the storm's fury. In the flickering lantern light, his face looked carved from stone, all sharp angles and shadows, but his eyes, when they met hers, were worried. "Are you all right?" he asked, having to raise his voice to be heard. She nodded, though in truth her heart was racing and her hands were shaking. "I have never been in a storm like this. Texas weather can be fierce, but this cellar is solid. We will be safe here." A tremendous crash sounded from above, something large hitting the building, or perhaps the building itself losing a piece. Celia gasped and instinctively reached out, her hand finding Quinn's arm. His muscles were like iron beneath her fingers, solid and reassuring. "I am scared," she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. Quinn moved closer, not inappropriately so, but near enough that his presence was a comfort. "It is all right to be scared. Fear keeps us smart, but I promise you, Celia, I will not let anything happen to you." She believed him. This man who barely knew her, who owed her nothing, was standing guard over her like some ancient warrior. It made something warm bloom in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat of the cellar and everything to do with the way Quinn was looking at her. The storm lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes. When the roaring finally began to subside, Quinn cautiously opened the cellar door and peered out. "It has passed," he said, "but there is damage. Quite a bit from what I can see." They emerged into a changed Trinity. The street was littered with debris, broken boards, shattered glass, a cart overturned and smashed beyond repair. The mercantile had lost several roof shingles, but the structure itself appeared sound. Other buildings had not been so lucky. The church's steeple was leaning at a dangerous angle, and the saloon's front window was completely blown out. People began emerging from their shelters, faces shocked as they surveyed the destruction. And there, in the middle of the street, was Mrs. Hartwell, standing beside her ruined vegetable garden and weeping openly. Her prized greenhouse, the envy of Trinity, had been completely demolished, its glass panes scattered like diamonds across the muddy ground. Celia felt Quinn tense beside her. They both remembered Mrs. Hartwell slamming the door in his face, refusing to heed his warning. But Quinn simply walked over to the distraught woman. "Madam, are you hurt?" Mrs. Hartwell looked up, her face tear-streaked and ashamed. "No, Mr. Osborne, I am so sorry. You tried to warn me, and I did not listen, and now—" "What matters is that you are safe," Quinn said firmly. "The greenhouse can be rebuilt. Let me help you clear this debris." And without waiting for permission, he began picking up the larger pieces of broken glass and wood, carefully stacking them to the side. After a moment's hesitation, Celia joined him, and then others came too, until half the town was helping clean up the Hartwell's property. Mrs. Hartwell watched with tears still streaming down her face, but there was something different in her expression now, something humbled and perhaps a bit ashamed. When the worst of the debris was cleared, she approached Celia directly. "Miss Jennings, I owe you an apology. You and Mr. Osborne both tried to help us today, tried to warn us, and I have been nothing but cruel to you since you arrived. I am sorry." Celia was so surprised she almost could not speak. Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. That means a great deal." "You are a good girl," Mrs. Hartwell said, and this time her tone held genuine warmth. "I was wrong about you. I hope you can forgive an old woman's foolishness." "Of course." As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across Trinity's battered streets, the townspeople gathered to assess the damage and plan repairs. And for the first time since Celia had arrived, she felt like she was part of the community rather than an outsider looking in. People nodded to her, thanked her for helping spread the warning, asked if she was all right. But it was Quinn's presence beside her that meant the most. He had stayed in town to help with the cleanup, and now, as the meeting dispersed and people headed to their homes, he walked with her back toward the mercantile. "You were very brave today," he said quietly. "Going door to door like that, helping with the cleanup. Trinity is lucky to have you." I think Trinity is lucky to have you, Celia countered. If you had not warned us, people might have been seriously hurt. They stopped in front of the mercantile, neither seeming eager to part ways despite the late hour and the exhaustion written on both their faces. Celia, Quinn said, his voice rougher than usual, I know I am just a mountain man. I know I do not have much to offer, but I would very much like to call on you properly if you would allow it. Her heart leaped. I would like that very much. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his stern face into something almost boyish. Good. That is good. I will come by next Sunday afternoon, if that suits you. It suits me perfectly. Quinn tipped his hat to her and turned to go, but Celia called after him. Quinn? He looked back. Be safe getting home tonight. Always am, he said. But his smile said he appreciated her concern. When Miss Abernathy returned the next day and found half the town singing Celia's praises, she was forced to grudgingly acknowledge that perhaps the girl was not entirely without merit. She even agreed, after some convincing from Reverend Thomas and Mrs. Hartwell, that Celia could receive gentlemen callers on Sunday afternoons, provided everything remained proper. That first Sunday, Quinn arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, freshly shaved and wearing what were clearly his best clothes, though they were still rough by town standards. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers that he must have picked on his way into Trinity, their bright colors a cheerful splash against his weathered hands. For you, he said, offering them to Celia with an awkwardness that she found endearing. They are beautiful. Thank you. Miss Abernathy had grudgingly allowed them use of the mercantile's front porch, where they could sit and talk while still remaining visible and proper. It was not the most romantic setting, but to Celia it felt like paradise. They talked for hours that first afternoon. Quinn told her about his childhood in Ohio, about growing up on a farm with 4 brothers and learning to hunt and trap from his father. He spoke about the war, though his words were careful and sparse, and Celia understood that those were memories he still struggled with. He described his life in the hills, the cabin he had built with his own hands, the rhythms of hunting and trapping and simply surviving. Celia, in turn, spoke about her own childhood, the happy years before the fever took her parents. She told him about her father, a carpenter who had taught her to read, and her mother, who had loved music and singing. She even spoke about the Poorhouse, though it hurt to remember those years. It was not all bad, she said quietly. There were some kind people there, but you always felt like a burden, like a failure. I swore that if I ever got out, I would make something of myself, would prove that I was more than just a charity case. Quinn reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was calloused and rough, but his touch was gentle. You are not a charity case, Celia. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. What you have survived, what you have overcome, it takes real courage. Do not ever let anyone make you feel ashamed of where you came from. She squeezed his hand, blinking back tears. How do you always know exactly what to say? I do not, he admitted. Most of the time I'm terrible with words, but with you, it feels easier somehow. Over the following weeks, their courtship deepened. Quinn came to town every Sunday without fail, and sometimes during the week as well, always with some excuse about needing supplies or checking on repairs from the storm. They would walk together through Trinity's streets, or sit on the mercantile porch, or sometimes take short walks out into the prairie, always careful to keep within sight of town to maintain propriety. Celia learned that beneath Quinn's rough exterior was a man of deep intelligence and surprising gentleness. He had taught himself to read and write despite his limited schooling, and he spoke thoughtfully about everything from politics to philosophy to the patterns of animal behavior he had observed in the wilderness. Quinn, in turn, seemed to discover in Celia someone who saw him as more than just a rough mountain man. She appreciated his quiet strength, his innate kindness, his fierce protectiveness. She made him laugh, something he confessed he had not done much of in recent years. She challenged his opinions and made him think, and he told her once that talking with her was the highlight of his week. I used to think I was content with my solitary life, he admitted one Sunday, as they sat watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. But since I met you, Celia, that cabin feels emptier than it used to. I find myself counting the days until I can see you again. I count them too, she confessed. The week feels so long between your visits. He turned to face her fully, his gray-blue eyes serious. "Celia, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Her heart began to race. "All right. I am not a rich man. I probably never will be. My cabin is comfortable but simple, and life in the hills is hard work. But I can provide for a wife, can keep her safe and warm and fed. And I love you, Celia Jennings. I have loved you since the day I first saw you in that store, looking so brave despite how the world had treated you. Will you marry me? Will you come live with me in my house, be my wife, share my life?" Joy flooded through Celia like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Yes, Quinn, I will marry you. I love you too. I think I started falling for you the day you defended me in that church." Quinn pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her close against his broad chest. She could feel the rapid beating of his heart, could feel the strength in his embrace, and she had never felt safer or more cherished in her entire life. "She is coming to my house now," Quinn said, almost wonderingly, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune. "You are really going to be my wife." "I really am," Celia agreed, laughing through happy tears. They went inside to tell Miss Abernathy, who received the news with less enthusiasm but grudging acceptance. "Well, I suppose I cannot say I did not see this coming. When will the wedding be?" "As soon as possible," Quinn said firmly, his arm still around Celia's waist. "I see no reason to wait." Reverend Thomas agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday. It would be a simple wedding, but Celia did not care about elaborate celebrations. All she wanted was to begin her life with Quinn. The news spread through Trinity like wildfire. "She came from the Poorhouse," the whispers said, but now there was a different tone to them, less judgment and more wonder. "And now she is marrying the mountain man." Mrs. Hartwell, true to her reformed nature, organized a small reception after the ceremony and even donated fabric for Celia to make a wedding dress. Other women in town contributed what they could: lace for trim, ribbon for her hair, a pair of white gloves that had been saved from someone's own wedding years before. Celia worked on her dress every evening after the store closed, her needle flying through the pale blue fabric, blue for her new beginning, for the vast Texas sky, for Quinn's remarkable eyes. On the morning of her wedding, Celia woke early and dressed with trembling hands. The dress fit perfectly, the blue fabric bringing out the gold in her hazel eyes. She pinned her dark blonde hair up in a simple style and secured the borrowed white gloves. Miss Abernathy appeared in the doorway, looking almost emotional. "You look lovely, girl, truly." "Thank you, Miss Abernathy, for everything, for giving me this chance, for letting Quinn call on me. I will not lie and say I understood it at first," Miss Abernathy admitted. "But that man loves you. Anyone can see it. And you have done well for yourself. You should be proud." The church was full when Celia arrived, the entire town having turned out to witness the wedding. She saw the Hartwells in the front pew, Mrs. Hartwell dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw the shopkeepers and farmers and their families, the same people who had whispered about her just months before. But she only had eyes for Quinn. He stood at the altar in a new suit that must have cost him dearly, his long hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven. When he saw her walking down the aisle, his expression transformed with such naked love and joy that Celia felt tears prick her eyes. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with warmth and sincerity. When it came time for the vows, Quinn's voice was steady and strong. "I, Quinn Osborne, take you, Celia Jennings, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to protect you, provide for you, cherish you, and love you for all the days of my life." Celia's voice shook but did not falter. "I, Celia Jennings, take you, Quinn Osborne, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you, support you, honor you, and love you for all the days of my life." When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn cupped Celia's face in his large hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart overflow. The reception was a joyful affair, with food and music and dancing in the church hall. People congratulated them with genuine warmth, and if anyone still harbored judgments about Celia's past, they had the good sense to keep them to themselves. As the sun began to set, Quinn helped Celia into his wagon. now loaded with her few possessions and supplies for their life together. The townspeople gathered to see them off, waving and calling out good wishes. "She is going to his house now," Celia heard someone say, but the words held no malice, only a kind of fairy tale wonder. As the wagon rolled out of Trinity toward the hills that would be her new home, Celia looked back one last time at the town where she had arrived in shame just a few months before. She was leaving as a married woman, loved and respected, with a future full of promise stretching before her. "Are you ready?" Quinn asked, his hand finding hers on the wagon seat. Celia laced her fingers through his and smiled. "I am ready for anything, as long as I am with you." The journey to Quinn's cabin took 3 hours, winding through increasingly rugged terrain as they climbed into the hills north of Trinity. The landscape was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, with rocky outcroppings and twisted mesquite trees and the occasional glimpse of deer or wild turkey darting through the brush. As dusk fell, they rounded a final bend, and Celia got her first look at what would be her home. Quinn's cabin sat in a small clearing beside a spring-fed creek. It was larger than she had expected, solidly built from logs he had cut and shaped himself. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch stretched across the front. Behind the cabin she could see an outhouse, a small barn, and what looked like a smokehouse. "It is not much," Quinn said, suddenly sounding nervous, "but it is sturdy and warm, and I can add on to it if you want more space." "It is perfect," Celia said honestly. To her, who had spent years sleeping in a crowded poorhouse dormitory and the last months in a storage closet, the cabin looked like a palace. Quinn helped her down from the wagon and swept her up into his arms, carrying her across the threshold in the traditional manner. The interior of the cabin was dim in the fading light, but Quinn quickly lit several lanterns, revealing a surprisingly comfortable space. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking pot hanging from an iron hook. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a comfortable-looking armchair near the hearth. A door at the back led to what must be the bedroom. Everything was meticulously clean and well organized. Quinn might live alone in the wilderness, but he clearly took pride in his home. "Let me show you the rest," Quinn said, leading her to the bedroom. It was smaller than the main room, but cozy, with a large bed covered in a beautiful quilt, a dresser, and a window that would let in morning light. Quinn had clearly made an effort to prepare for her arrival. There were wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, and the bed had fresh linens. "I made the quilt myself," he admitted, looking embarrassed. "Last winter. I know it is not the finest needlework, but I tried." Celia ran her hand over the quilt, touched beyond words. The stitching was indeed somewhat clumsy, but the pattern was carefully chosen and the colors beautiful. The idea of this strong, rough man sitting by firelight and painstakingly sewing a quilt made her fall in love with him all over again. "It is the most beautiful quilt I have ever seen," she said, meaning every word. Quinn pulled her into his arms, and for a long moment they simply held each other, the reality of their new life together finally sinking in. They were married. This was their home. They had the rest of their lives stretching before them. When Quinn kissed her this time, there was passion alongside the tenderness, and Celia responded with equal fervor. They were husband and wife now, and as the night deepened around them, they came together in love and commitment, sealing their vows in the most intimate way possible. Later, lying in Quinn's arms with her head on his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Celia felt a peace she had never known. All the years of struggle, all the shame and hardship had led her to this moment. She had come from the poorhouse, but she was going to Quinn's house now, going to a life filled with love and purpose. "Are you happy?" Quinn murmured, his hand stroking her hair. "I have never been happier," she replied honestly. "I love you so much, Quinn." "I love you too, Celia. I promise I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a rough mountain man." She tilted her head up to kiss him. "You're not rough." "Well, you are. But you are also kind and gentle and good. You are everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know what I wanted." The next days and weeks passed in a blur of happiness as Celia adjusted to her new life. Living in the wilderness was indeed hard work, but it was satisfying in a way her job at the mercantile had never been. Quinn taught her how to tend the vegetable garden he had started behind the cabin, how to preserve meat and make tallow candles, and do the 100 other tasks necessary for frontier living. In return, Celia brought her own skills to their household. She was an excellent cook, able to make delicious meals from simple ingredients. She mended Quinn's clothes and made new ones. She organized their supplies and kept meticulous records of their stores. She even learned to help Quinn with skinning and preparing the animals he trapped and hunted. But beyond the practical partnership, there was genuine joy in their life together. Quinn would sometimes come in from working outside to find Celia singing as she worked, and he would stop just to listen, his face soft with contentment. Celia would wake in the morning to find Quinn already up, making coffee and breakfast so she could sleep a little longer. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the hills, talking about everything and nothing. Once a month, they would make the journey into Trinity for supplies and to attend church. The townspeople always greeted them warmly now, asking after their welfare and sharing news. Mrs. Hartwell had become an unlikely friend, often sending Celia home with cuttings from her rebuilt greenhouse or recipes she thought Celia might enjoy. 6 months into their marriage, on a crisp November morning, Celia woke feeling queasy. She barely made it outside before being sick, and when she returned to the cabin, Quinn was looking at her with concern and dawning hope. "Celia," he asked carefully. She pressed a hand to her stomach, counting back the weeks in her mind, and felt a surge of joy so intense it took her breath away. "I think I am with child." Quinn let out a whoop of delight and swept her into his arms, spinning her around before carefully setting her back down, suddenly worried he had been too rough. "A baby? We are going to have a baby?" "I believe so. It is still early, but all the signs are there." He dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach, and Celia felt tears stream down her face at the sight of this strong man brought low by happiness and wonder. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this gift. Thank you for loving me." "Thank you for choosing me," she replied, running her fingers through his hair. "Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me, when everyone else only saw the poorhouse girl." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite the isolation and hard work of frontier life. Quinn became almost comically protective, refusing to let Celia lift anything heavy or do any task he deemed too strenuous. He made the journey into Trinity more frequently to ensure she had proper food and supplies, and he spent hours fashioning a beautiful cradle from smooth pine wood. Mrs. Hartwell organized a quilting bee, and the women of Trinity created a stunning baby quilt, each square sewn with care and good wishes. When they presented it to Celia, she wept with gratitude at how far she had come from the girl they had whispered about to the expectant mother they now celebrated. As spring arrived and Celia's belly grew round and full, Quinn became increasingly anxious about the birth. They were 3 hours from Trinity, 3 hours from the midwife who attended most of the births in the area. What if something went wrong? What if the baby came early? "We could stay in town for the last few weeks," he suggested for the 3rd time in as many days, but Celia was firm. "No, I want our baby to be born here, in our home. I will be fine, Quinn. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my wife, not my baby." His fear was palpable, and Celia finally understood its source one night as they lay in bed, her back pressed against his chest, his hand spread protectively over her belly. "My mother died in childbirth," Quinn said quietly. "With my youngest brother. I was 12. I remember how my father fell apart, how lost we all were. I cannot lose you, Celia. I cannot." She turned in his arms to face him. "You are not going to lose me. I am strong, and the baby is healthy. I can feel it. Everything is going to be all right." "You cannot know that." "No," she admitted, "but I have faith. Faith in my body, faith in our baby, and faith that God did not bring us together just to tear us apart now." Despite her reassurances, Quinn insisted on bringing the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, up to the cabin 2 weeks before Celia's due date. The older woman agreed to stay with them until after the birth, and her calm, competent presence eased some of Quinn's anxiety. Celia went into labor on a warm June morning. The contractions started mild and far apart, giving her time to prepare mentally for what was to come. Quinn was a wreck, pacing the cabin like a caged mountain lion, jumping at every sound Celia made. "You should go outside," Mrs. Patterson finally told him. "You're making everyone nervous. Go chop wood or check your traps or something. I will call you when it is time." Quinn looked torn between relief and guilt, but Celia shooed him away. She is right. I need to focus, and I cannot do that if I am worried about you wearing a hole in the floor. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. I love you. You are the strongest, bravest woman I know. You can do this. I know I can, she said, smiling despite the contraction that was building. Now go. The labor lasted all day and into the evening. It was hard and painful and exhausting, but Mrs. Patterson guided Celia through each stage with encouragement and practical advice. And when the final pushes came, when Celia bore down with all her remaining strength, she thought of everything she had overcome to reach this moment, the poorhouse, the shame, the whispers, the loneliness. She had survived all of that. She could survive this too. The baby's first cry split the air, strong and healthy, and Celia fell back against the pillows, sobbing with relief and joy. It is a boy, Mrs. Patterson announced, quickly cleaning the infant and wrapping him in a soft blanket. A big, healthy boy. She placed the baby in Celia's arms, and Celia looked down at her son for the first time. He had dark hair like Quinn and was red-faced from crying, his tiny fists waving in the air. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Quinn, she called out weakly, come meet your son. The door burst open, and Quinn rushed in, his face pale and anxious. But when he saw Celia sitting up, alive and well with the baby in her arms, the relief that washed over him was almost palpable. He approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at his son with an expression of such pure wonder that Celia felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Can I hold him? Quinn asked. Of course, he is your son too. Quinn took the baby with surprising gentleness for such large hands, cradling him against his broad chest. The baby stopped crying, apparently soothed by his father's heartbeat, and made a small snuffling sound. Hello, little one, Quinn whispered. I'm your papa. I've been waiting so long to meet you. What should we name him? Celia asked. They had discussed names before, but had been unable to agree on one. Now, watching Quinn with their son, Celia knew exactly what name was right. What about Thomas? She suggested. After your father. Quinn looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright. You would do that? Name him after my father? Your father helped make you who you are. I think it is a fine name. Thomas Quinn Osborne, Quinn said, testing out the full name. It sounds good, strong. It is perfect. Mrs. Patterson stayed for another week, helping Celia recover and teaching her the basics of infant care. Young Thomas proved to be a good baby, healthy and alert, with a powerful set of lungs that he used primarily at night. Quinn would wake at the first cry, insisting on letting Celia sleep as much as possible, and she would often wake to find him pacing the cabin with Thomas, cradled against his chest, singing old army songs in a surprisingly sweet baritone. As summer turned to fall and Thomas grew and changed, Celia marveled at how her life had transformed. 2 years ago, she'd been scrubbing floors in the Houston poorhouse with no family and no future. Now she had a husband who loved her deeply, a beautiful son, and a home in the wild Texas hills. The whispers that had once followed her, she came from the poorhouse, seemed like they belonged to a different lifetime. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with Thomas sleeping peacefully in Celia's arms, Quinn took her hand. I have been thinking, he said, about the future. Oh? What about it? I do not want Thomas growing up completely isolated. He should have friends, should go to school. I was thinking maybe we could build a second cabin closer to Trinity, somewhere we could stay during the winter months so he could attend school. Celia considered this. That's a wonderful idea, but only if it is what you want too. I do not want you to give up this life for us. You and Thomas are my life now, Quinn said simply. Everything else is just details. Besides, I was thinking I could offer my services as a hunting guide, maybe help supply meat to the town. There are more people settling in this area every year. We could make it work. Over the next year, Quinn built a second, smaller cabin on a piece of land he purchased just outside Trinity. It was not as remote as their hill cabin, but it still offered privacy and space. They would spend springs and summers in the hills where Quinn could trap and hunt, and autumns and winters in the town cabin where Thomas could attend school once he was old enough, and where Celia could maintain friendships with the other women. It was the best of both worlds, and their life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Thomas grew into a sturdy, cheerful toddler who loved both the wilderness and the town. Quinn's guide business proved successful, and they became well-respected members of the Trinity community. 3 years after Thomas's birth, Celia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Jane. 2 years after that came another son, Benjamin. Quinn built additions onto both cabins to accommodate their growing family, and Celia found joy in motherhood that she had never imagined possible during her lonely years in the poorhouse. The whispers, when they came now, were entirely different. "Can you believe she came from the poorhouse?" people would say, watching Celia with her 3 beautiful children and her devoted husband. "Look at her now." And Celia would smile because she could hardly believe it herself sometimes. But she had learned that where you started in life mattered far less than the choices you made and the people who chose to stand beside you. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn surprised her by taking her back to that same church where he had first defended her against Mrs. Hartwell's judgment. The building had been expanded over the years, the dangerous steeple replaced with a solid new structure. But standing there, Celia could still remember how she had felt that day, small and ashamed and convinced she would never be anything more than the poorhouse girl. "Do you remember what you said to Mrs. Hartwell that day?" she asked Quinn. "I said judging a person by their circumstances rather than their character was not very Christian," he replied, pulling her close. "You changed my life that day, not just because you defended me, but because you made me believe I was worthy of defending. You saw me, Quinn, truly saw me, and that made all the difference." He kissed her forehead. "You are always worthy, Celia, always strong and brave and good. I just helped you see it yourself." They stood together in the quiet church, holding each other as they had held each other through 10 years of marriage, through challenges and triumphs, through the building of a life and a family. Outside, they could hear their children playing in the churchyard, Thomas, now 10 years old, and trying to teach 7-year-old Sarah Jane and 5-year-old Benjamin how to climb a tree. Their laughter rang out clear and joyful, the sound of a happy childhood, something neither Quinn nor Celia had fully experienced themselves, but were determined to give their children. "She came from the poorhouse," the whispers had once said, cruel and judging. But now, as Celia Osborne stood in her husband's arms with her children's laughter floating through the air, she knew the truth. Where she had come from mattered far less than where she had ended up. And she had ended up exactly where she belonged, in Quinn's house, in Quinn's arms, in Quinn's heart. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's height and his mother's keen intelligence. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, inspired by the traveling physician who visited Trinity twice a year, and Quinn and Celia saved every spare penny to make that dream possible. Sarah Jane inherited her mother's determination and her father's love of the outdoors. She could track game almost as well as Quinn by the time she was 12, though she also showed a talent for sketching the wildlife she observed, filling journals with remarkably detailed drawings. Benjamin was their quieter child, thoughtful and gentle, who loved books and learning. He would sit for hours listening to Celia read, and Quinn built him a small desk where he could practice his letters and numbers. The cabin in the hills, where it had all begun, remained their summer retreat, the place where the Osborne family felt most themselves. Quinn taught all 3 children the skills he had learned over years in the wilderness: how to read the weather, how to move quietly through the forest, how to respect and understand the land. Celia, meanwhile, had become known throughout Trinity and beyond for her skill with medicinal herbs. She had taught herself through careful study and experimentation, creating salves and tinctures that eased everything from rheumatism to colic. People would come from miles around seeking her remedies, and she never turned anyone away, remembering what it felt like to be desperate and alone. On the 20th anniversary of the day, Celia had arrived in Trinity, that terrifying day when she had climbed down from a wagon with nothing but shame and hope. The town threw a celebration in her honor. It was Mrs. Hartwell's idea, now elderly, but still sharp as a tack. 20 years ago, we nearly lost one of the finest people to ever grace this town because of our own prejudice and small-mindedness, Mrs. Hartwell announced at the celebration, her voice carrying across the crowded church hall. Celia Jennings came to us from the Houston Poorhouse, and we whispered about her like she was something to be ashamed of. but she showed us grace and courage and strength. And Quinn Osborne showed us what it means to see the true worth of a person. Today, we celebrate not just 20 years of Celia's presence in Trinity, but 20 years of the lessons she taught us about charity, dignity, and the real meaning of community. There was not a dry eye in the hall as people applauded. Celia stood with Quinn's arm around her waist, and her 3 nearly grown children beside her, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she'd been given, the family she had built, the community that had eventually embraced her. Later, after the celebration had ended and they had returned to their town cabin, Celia sat on the porch with Quinn, just as they had done countless times before. The children were inside, cleaning up from the party, their voices drifting through the open windows. "I never imagined this," Celia said quietly. "When I was in that poorhouse, scrubbing floors and mending clothes, I never let myself imagine I could have something like this. It seemed impossible." Quinn pulled her closer. "You made it possible. Your courage, your refusal to let your circumstances define you, your willingness to hope even when hope seemed foolish. You did that, Celia." "We did it together," she corrected. "I could not have done any of it without you. You are the one who first believed in me." "I just saw what was already there," he said. "You were always this strong, this capable, this worthy of love and respect. I'm just grateful I got to be the one to walk beside you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, a nightbird called out its lonely song. These were the sounds of the Texas wilderness that had become the soundtrack of their life together. "Do you ever regret it?" Celia asked suddenly. "Taking on a poorhouse girl? You could have had an easier life with someone from a better family, someone who came with a dowry and connections." Quinn turned to look at her, his weathered face serious in the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows. "Not for a single second, not ever. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Celia. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up each morning with gratitude. If I could go back and live my life over, I would not change a single thing, because every choice I made led me to you." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and unwavering commitment. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I love you, Quinn Osborne," Celia said. "From that first day in the mercantile until my very last breath, I will love you." "And I love you, Celia Osborne, the girl from the poorhouse who came to my house and made it a home." Inside, they could hear Thomas telling his siblings some story that had Benjamin laughing and Sarah Jane protesting that it could not possibly be true. It was the sound of family, of love, of a life well lived. Years later, when Thomas had become a respected doctor in Dallas, when Sarah Jane had married a surveyor and moved to Colorado to sketch the Rocky Mountains, when Benjamin had opened a bookstore in Trinity and was raising his own family, Celia and Quinn remained in their beloved hill cabin. They were older now, Quinn's dark hair liberally streaked with silver, Celia's face lined with age and laughter. But the love between them had never dimmed. If anything, it had grown deeper and richer with time, tempered by shared struggles and strengthened by shared joys. On a warm spring morning, much like the one when they had first met, Celia stood in her garden behind the cabin, tending the herbs and vegetables with practiced hands. Quinn was nearby, repairing a fence, his movements slower now, but still sure and competent. A rider approached up the trail, and they both looked up to see a young woman dismounting. She looked nervous and uncertain, her clothes worn and her face thin with hunger. "Excuse me," the girl said hesitantly. "I'm looking for work. Someone in Trinity said that you folks might need help with the garden and preserving for the winter. I do not have much experience, but I'm a hard worker, and I learn quick." Celia and Quinn exchanged a long look, seeing in this girl's anxious eyes an echo of Celia's own past. The girl was clearly poor, clearly desperate, and if the whispers Celia had heard in town were true, she had come from rough circumstances. "What is your name, dear?" Celia asked gently. "Margaret, madam. Margaret Howell." "Well, Margaret, we could certainly use some help around here. Why don't you come inside? We can discuss the details over some food. You look like you could use a good meal." The girl's eyes filled with grateful tears. "Thank you, madam. Thank you so much." As Margaret followed Celia toward the cabin, Quinn caught his wife's hand and squeezed it gently. They both understood the gift they were being given, the chance to be for this girl what others had been for Celia all those years ago, the chance to offer not just work, but dignity, respect, and hope. That evening, after Margaret had been fed and shown to the small guest room they kept for visitors, Celia and Quinn sat together on their porch one more time. The sun was setting in brilliant shades of orange and pink, painting the Texas hills in colors that took Celia's breath away, even after decades of watching these sunsets. "She reminds me of you," Quinn said quietly. That look in her eyes, like she's afraid to hope but cannot quite help herself. "I know," Celia replied. "I see myself in her, lost and scared but determined not to show it." "You will help her, won't you? The way people helped you." "Of course. How could I not? Someone once told me that judging people by their circumstances rather than their character was wrong. Someone once stood up for a poorhouse girl when the whole town was ready to dismiss her. I learned from that example, Quinn. I learned that compassion and faith in people's potential can change everything." Quinn pulled her close, and they sat together as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began their nightly dance overhead. Around them, the wilderness sang its evening song, and inside their cabin, a young woman who had lost hope was sleeping soundly, dreaming perhaps of a future that might hold more than hardship and shame. And Celia thought about the miracle of her own life, how she'd come from the poorhouse and ended up here, in Quinn's house, in Quinn's arms, surrounded by love and purpose and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She came from the poorhouse, the whispers had said all those years ago, meant as judgment and condemnation. But Celia had learned to rewrite that story. She had come from the poorhouse, yes, but she had also come into love. She had come into dignity. She had come into a life richer than she had ever imagined possible. And now, by helping Margaret, she would help someone else rewrite their story too. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Quinn and Celia finally went inside, closing the door on the wilderness and stepping into the warmth of their home. They had built this life together, log by log, choice by choice, day by day. It had not always been easy, but it had been good. So very, very good. And as they lay in bed that night, Quinn's arms around Celia just as they had been on their wedding night, so many years before, Celia whispered a prayer of gratitude into the darkness. For second chances, for mountain men who saw the worth in poorhouse girls, for love that transformed shame into strength and loneliness into belonging. "She is coming to my house now," Quinn had said all those years ago, his voice filled with joy and wonder, and Celia had come, had made his house her home, had filled it with love and laughter and life. It was the best decision either of them had ever made, and as sleep claimed them both, they rested easy in the knowledge that their love story was complete, their ending truly happy, their life together everything either of them had ever needed or wanted. The mountain man and the poorhouse girl had found each other against all odds, had built a love that weathered every storm, and had created a legacy that would extend far beyond their own years. It was a story of hope triumphant, of love conquering prejudice, of two people who dared to see the best in each other, and, in doing so, brought out the best in themselves. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.